of a CUDA program now, right? Like how it's getting divided into this host code and the device code. And we also gave some examples of this kind of basic programs like this vector addition and all that, where again the primary purpose was to provide you with the basic programming framework, like, well, how to really get started with it, how to write code for the a basic host program, right? So here we had that example, like how to write a basic vector at CUDA kernel, and along with that, what would be the driver code? So this was the vector at CUDA kernel, right? And then there was the driver code. And this code, if you see, there are, I mean, it has got many errors and all that. I mean, error messages, error catch exceptions and all that. So the very idea here is that to familiarize with you, I mean, how this, I mean, apart from just using the CUDA malloc, what kind of errors it can throw. And in such cases, I mean, how to print the messages, debug messages and all that, right? So, and also to familiarize you with all these semantics in CUDA, like what it means by command. I mean, the basic flags like CUDA success, CUDA failure, and all that, which are all available with the system, so it will recognize them. So, and finally, the code also helps you to understand how to copy data from the host side to the device side and get the result back using the CUDA memcopy commands with the flags like host to device and device to host and all that. And finally, how to launch the kernels and overall execute the program, right? So, so I think these parts you must have gone through the videos, and overall you understand how the basic programming framework works and what are the constraints. And the next thing that came up was how really you define, how really you pack the set of CUDA threads when you are launching a kernel. So the entire idea is about writing a parallel program with a huge number of threads, right? And so how you really specify the threads has got a lot to do how really your kernel will perform, right? We'll see that later on. But you have to first learn how to really specify this packing of threads using this idea of grids, right? Grids and blocks. So that is, and also those are the things which have been discussed here in the slide, like how the threads get packed based on your block dimension, how the threads are kind of sequenced. So, and given for each thread, what are the system variables that will be known inside? Like for each thread, uh, well, these are the overall system variables that you have, that for a given GPU system that you are running. Uh, so you can specify through these variables what would be your grid dimension and block dimension in the X, Y, and Z dimensions, right? And finally, when you are running the program, then for each of the threads, you will have, I mean, depending on in which block the thread is residing, and inside that block, what is the local thread ID. The overall idea is that for each thread, these values of thread IDX dot x, block dim, I mean block IDX at x, these combinations would be such that each thread can be finally evaluated to a global thread ID like this. For example, this was a 2D kernel, so for which I can find out the global thread ID like this. And the whole idea is that all these I values would be unique for each of the three threads, right? Each thread will have this unique I value. And since this is its global thread ID, which is unique, the way the program will flow through the overall logic, that means you can, I mean, when you are writing the if else's in your program, or you are doing some looping structure, everywhere you can use this value of I to decide on whether this particular thread is getting into some if else structure or not getting into some if else structure and all that. So this I will be unique for each thread and is like private value to each thread, right? So that was one of the important points which we should mention. And then came the different classes of CUDA functions. I mean, you specify that based on where they really execute, whether they execute in the device or they execute in the host, and they can be called from which function, which of the devices. So the standard thing is you have a function which is executing in the host, and from the host you can call a function which will execute in the device. So that is why most of our functions will be like this. They will have this global ID for the kernel functions, will have the second type, right? So that you have a host program which will call it. If you have a function particularly for executing in the host, it will have a specific host flag. In case you don't specify anything here, then by default it is assumed that it's like a normal C program or normal C function which will execute in the host, that is the CPU. And if a function is specified with type device, that means what? It will be callable from other functions in that executing in the device only, right? So then we provided some example codes again, right? So this was the kind of the first slide which provided you with some simple programming examples from the Julia sets and matrix manipulation programs, basic complex number and all that, right? So that was all. I mean, there is nothing particular. I guess all of you here are programming pros. So this program is, I mean, these examples are like cakewalks for you, right? And then the slide also had all these Google Colab details. I think further details we have already posted in this Google Meet. So you can take that up separately in the tutorial session. And then we also had this fourth lecture, right? Now this was from where the real deal actually starts, like how really you can control the execution of multiple threads together. So this is where we actually define how you can create these thread mappings using grids and blocks. You can fundamentally define a multi-dimensional grid and block. And the dimension is limited by grid can be 3-dimensional, and inside the grid the blocks can again be 3-dimensional, right? Now it is not necessary that every grid and block that you define will always have 3 dimensions. You can have 2D kernels, even 1D kernels. So in those cases, the other dimensions will be implicitly taken as 1, right? The CUDA system will be able to understand that. Now, once you define the grid dimension and once a thread is launched, so that grid dim is defined, then every value for each thread, the grid dim.x, y, z, these variables will be inside this kind of a range, right? And well, once the grid dimensions are known, then the block IDs, of course, have to be inside the grid dimensions. So the block IDs in the X, Y, and Z directions will also belong to the ranges corresponding to the grid dimensions in the X, Y, and Z directions, right? And in that way, you can, for each block, you will have a block ID X, Y, Z pair. And for that, and I mean, for each thread in a block, I mean, each block you can identify it using this block IDX, block IDY, block IDZ triple. And inside that block for every thread, you will again have a thread IDX, thread IDY, and the thread IDZ triple. Now, well, there are some constraints here. So let us specify those constraints particularly. For example, till date, for definitely you are mapping the kernel to a hardware. So there is a maximum limit, right, to the number of thread contexts that the hardware can support. So from that perspective, your this grid dimension is having an upper limit like this, and also, I mean, it is the upper limit in each of the dimensions, but that doesn't mean that, well, I mean, it will stay so for future. In future, as new architectures evolve, these things may be changing. But what is important for you to understand from a coding perspective is that till date, the size of blocks are limited by a number 1024. I think in new architectures, it is 2048. So like it's, so that means that, well, this idea that, well, you have a hierarchical packing of threads, right? So at the highest level, you have the set of blocks, and then inside each block, you have a set of threads together, right? Now, any idea, I mean, just asking, like, why do you think people thought that I will have blocks and then blocks will have inside that the threads? I mean, why can't I have just a set of threads? I mean, why do I need to have this set of grid as well as block? Why is there a hierarchy? Any idea? Have you thought about this?
Sir, maybe
Mapping
ease
to
of
different
programming.
SMs.
Yes.
Mapping to different SMs.
Okay. Any other option?
So
So it
maybe ease
depends
of
if you want
programming
to.
because
Yeah,
Uh,
fundamentally, it will be both ways, ease of programming and as well as thinking about the architecture. It would be ease of programming in the sense, suppose you are, your program can have some local requirements as well as global requirements, right? I mean, typically when you are writing a parallel program, that means you are dealing with billions, let's say millions of threads, let's say. Now, by normal algorithm characteristics, what happens? You all often have some local requirements for threads in the neighborhood, and you may have global requirements for which, job contexts sitting far apart due to some attribute, they may also exchange data or do something, right? So, well, then I can have many more levels in the hierarchy. Still now people thought, well, having two hierarchies is fine. And the second thing is, well, if you have looked into the basic GPU architecture slide, which we have showed you, so there are some set of streaming multiprocessors or SMs, right? In a GPU, we have a set of streaming multiprocessors. Inside the streaming multiprocessor, what do you have? So if we just draw one picture again. One minute. Something is happening in my system. Sorry, 1 minute. Somehow my stylus is creating a problem. Just give me a minute. Let me just restart the OneNote application. Okay, maybe we'll just use a good old PowerPoint slide here. So yeah. So let's say this is my SM1 and this is my SM2. Now each of the SMs, what are they supposed to have? They are supposed to have some shared memory, each of them, right? And apart from them, they are going to have lot of scalar processors like this, right? So the idea is when you divide a kernel's data space as in this hierarchy of grids and blocks. So this is the overall grid of threads, and you are dividing blocks. So the GPU scheduler, what will do is it will take some certain number of blocks and put them into some of the SMs, and then again we will take certain number of blocks and we will put them into some of the SMs. Okay. So what it will not do is it will not take a block and it will divide it among two SMs, and that is something which it will not do. Okay. So the idea is when you have things inside a block and they are executing in an SM, then there will be further scheduling that will be happening. So these things we will discuss later. My point that I'm trying to make here is by doing all these things, we are giving some advantage to the GPU system. We are saying that, well, some of the blocks will together go inside some of the SMs, and then from each of the blocks, certain threads will be chosen together to execute in lockstep, forming what we call as warps. Okay, so those threads will be executing together in a lockstep as warps, and now which warp will go when and all execute when and all that will be again decided by the GPU scheduler. So overall, there is a basic motivation why we'll require this kind of blocks. We'll learn more about it as we go into further issues on GPU scheduling. Now, right now here, for us to understand this, these blocks definitely have a upper bound of dimension, and accordingly, you have to choose a block specification which works. I mean, not that every block specification will give you 1024, right? So definitely you have to choose something that gives the total number of threads per block as less than 1024 or equal to 1024. Now, these are the slides we just try to show that, well, when I define the grid and give the blocks, how are the threads getting really organized? So it's like that I can say that the grid is containing threads like this. Inside the thread, I have blocks which have got this kind of IDs, right? As you can see that it's increasing kind of lexicographically, right? So the least significant bit, I would say, it is increasing, right? Then the next one increasing, then the next one increasing like that. And that's how the block IDs are arranged. And then inside one block, again, I can address the threads like this, right? So in that way, I can definitely design a set of threads and blocks. Now the question is, how do I choose whether to go into a 2D mapping of threads or 3D mapping of threads and all that? The idea is you will definitely make it as as a function of the application. Suppose you are designing a kernel which will work on 2D data, then using a two-dimensional grid and block makes perfect sense, right? So that is why maybe you will choose for a two-dimensional sequence of grids, grid and block, right? And I hope you have gone through this slide and there is no problem with these expressions that we have created here. Is this fine? Anybody?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. So I think it will be fine because as you can see with this, I can derive for every thread what is the global thread ID. And these are some of the relations which help me to derive what is the block number and thread number of a grid based on the other ID values, right? Now, if we see for that example, this is how the different blocks will sit. So each of the blocks here are colored in different colors. And for each of the blocks, we can see that what are the rows and columns, they are occupying in the 2D space of the matrix for that example. Now, so then there was some another example on a spectacle 8 cross 15 matrix and all that. So, and this is an example of a three-dimensional kernel. So if you take thread IDs and block IDs in 3 dimension, then the packing would look like this. So as you can see that each block is forming kind of a small 3D object, and together they are giving us the entire 3D matrix, right? Now, like I was saying, so when you are trying to run the kernel on the GPU, so you have the blocks getting scheduled on the different SMs, right? Now, inside an SM, the blocks can execute in any order. How it will execute depends on the hardware scheduler. So, practically, the idea is that these blocks say that, well, inside a block, as I was saying, that some of the threads will be packed together into warps, and those warps are the threads. So typically a warp is of size 32. So those 32 threads inside a warp, they will execute in lockstep. That means every program statement they will execute together. But otherwise, even inside a block, the warps are independent. Any warp can run after any time. Of course, there are some scheduling algorithms, but right now let's not assume any of them. So overall, we can say that, well, this is a kernel grid. You have the blocks, and those blocks are good to go. Now, depending on how many SMs you can have multiple number of blocks moving on in parallel. Or let's say, for example, here you can have so many blocks, 4 blocks executing in parallel. If there is support that many SPs which can physically support them. If you have a less number of scalar processors, then less number of blocks will execute, and it may take some more time and all that. The idea is you want to scale your application, right? So you don't really want the machine such that it will try to centrally control the execution of different blocks, right? Because in future architectures, you will like to add on to the, have more number of SPs and SMs. So the design has been such that there is no synchronization you can really do, across blocks. Can I not do any synchronization across blocks? Well, I can do. I can do through memory, but then that will be global memory. Is this comment understood what I just said, that I can synchronize across blocks, but that has to be through global memory? Hello?
So can you explain how how it will happen?
Okay, before that, tell me, have you understood how using sync thread you can synchronize inside a block?
Yes, sir.
So
For
suppose
that,
I
we
have
just
this
need
kind
to
of threads, right? All the threads are inside a block, and then all I will do is I will include something like a sync thread command here. So that suppose this thread, so these are all threads inside a block, right? Let's say this is the block, and there are many other threads which are coming all from the block, right? Suppose these threads have executed and these guys still have not reached this program point. So these guys are going to wait here until and unless this come, and only when all the threads come, then they all will again move forward, right? So that's how synchronization inside a block is done. But let's say I have something to do across blocks. How will I do? Well, practically inside the SM, you don't have any primitive, right? Inside the SM, you cannot. One idea is that you can do some global synchronization. For example, for that, you need some memory, right? For any kind of synchronization, you need some memory. So one idea is that you use the global memory of the GPU, DRAM, so that suppose some threads get some job done, right? And then they are practically waiting for some other threads to do something and dump that data in some global memory location. As long as it's not available, you have to wait there, right? So that is one kind of synchronization you can do, but that also doesn't make much sense, right? Because accessing the global memory is itself very difficult. So in typical GPU programming parlance, you do not really want to synchronize across blocks because that is going to take time. Of course, there may be applications for which in some cases it is absolutely essential, but the way the system has been designed is like this. Blocks can be, executing at any speed. Different blocks can execute at different speeds, doesn't really matter. But inside a block, I can synchronize using this kind of synchronization constants. So how the blocks will be executing, which will go for the, earlier, which block will come later, that is not much in your hand, right? So this is primarily done to ensure scalability and all that. And after that, we gave some simple examples, right? Like how to, do some this kind of parallel computations where you also need synchronization. Now, we use some application here in which we kept the workload of all the threads unbalanced so that you can actually see that, well, all the threads do not complete their work together, right? Some of the threads have got more work to do. So that means it will happen that you need the threads to synchronize here, right? And then you go forward and do the sum computation. Although let me tell you one thing, in this example that we are showing, we have taken very little number of threads. So suppose you have 10 threads, 20 threads and all that, then this synchronization will really not make sense. Can anybody tell me why?
Because they all run in the same wrap, and all the threads in a single wrap finish.
Wrap or warp?
Sorry, warp.
Don't be sorry. I also, first time I read, I used to pronounce wrap. Anyway. So, yeah, fine. So, as long as it's less than 32 threads, it's all executing in a single warp, right? So, they will anyway do things in a lockstep manner. So, if this guy is here, then the others will cannot go forward, right? So, you don't need the synchronization. But if you have more than that, a big matrix and all that, definitely you need the sync thread for the others to wait. And after that, what will you do? The overall idea was that to compute the total sum. The way we have written the program here is, once this is done, we allocate one of the threads the job of computing the sum. Like here, here was a sync thread, and after that we have put in the last thread to do the sum calculation. Again, there is another optimization you can do. That, well, why should I allocate one kernel only the job of calculating the sum? Because anyway, I have got so many kernels, and so many threads for inside the kernel, right? So I can calculate intermediate sums and get the overall sum by joint work among all the kernels, and that's what is happening by this standard reduction here. This is a very standard parallel reduction program. So what happens is, so suppose all the threads have calculated the partial sums and you want to add them. So in the first iteration, all the threads will just add, half of the threads will be active and they will just add their own sum and the next thread's sum. In the next iteration, 1/4 of them will be active. They will add two partial sums, and in that way, overall the number of threads will decrease logarithmically, and finally you will get the solution. So this is a very standard parallel reduction, for which this is the code, as you can see, that the loop stride, the value of s, which is the stride of the loop, the iterator s, which essentially is the stride of the threads here, that is kind of increasing in a factor of 2, and finally you get one thread giving you the final sum. But of course, against this, Rudrajyoti has a suggestion, right? Hello. Hello.
Yes, sir. It was posted on the that students discussion thread.
Explain to everybody.
I didn't post it, sir. Rudrajyoti, I don't know if he's here.
Okay, Rudrajyoti, are you there? Hello. Oh, he is not there in the class?
Sir, he is there. His mic is unmuted, but we can't hear him.
Okay, maybe there is some problem. But anyway, what he posted, did everybody understood?
Yeah, he's just saying that as soon as one of the columns stops addition, it adds the total value to a place where the total is being calculated, right? So at V11, I think.
Right. So he has a suggestion, which is that, well, let's say this thread has done its part. Now the others are still doing something. So this thread number 1 can go and add inside a partial sum of some variable which is supposed to store the full value, right? And we can keep on doing that for each of the other threads, and that. Well, we can actually do that using this atomic, which is one of the semaphore handles that we have inside CUDA for having critical access to a shared variable, right? So every thread can use such an atomic primitive to get access to that variable, update it, and in that way all the other thread can do. And actually, Anirban wrote the program today, and it's actually having some speed up, right? Anirban, you want to have a discussion on this?
Yeah, so maybe I can share my screen and explain.
Sure.
Yeah, just a sec.
Let me unshare my screen.
So is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you see the code here?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, so you will see that I've written actually two variants of it. So the first one, which is your sum triangle code snippet. So this is the one that is there in the slide itself, where like only the elements, where each thread actually adds up only the elements above the principal diagonal, and finally the last thread actually pushes the sum of these column totals into the last element of this array V. As Buddhajiti suggested, that instead of actually like relying on this particular for loop here, that is the moment all of those threads finish updating the column sums, and then the last thread is tasked with actually going through all the n elements and summing them up, we can approach it using a approach that is mentioned in the second kernel that you can see here. So this sum triangle with atomics. So the idea is that you want the moment, say a column sum has been computed by a particular thread, you would want that thread to add it to a particular shared variable that is visible across all the threads in a block. And then finally, all of these sums are actually getting accumulated into that shared variable. And then at the end, you will then try to update it into that place in your V array. All right. So if we have a look here, essentially, so your float sum, this is actually a private variable for each thread responsible for calculating the column totals. And finally, this shared float total sum, so you can see the qualifier shared here. So this is just to indicate that this is a variable that can be that is essentially visible across all the threads in a block. Okay, so that essentially means that updates to this particular variable shall be visible across all of the threads inside a CUDA thread block. Okay, now naturally you will have to initialize it. So by default, for shared float variables, you cannot actually directly initialize it. Okay, so you declare it, and then you'll have to ask one of the threads to actually initialize that. So naturally, you will have to have a sync threads call here. So can anybody tell me why I would require this?
So that the total sum would be initialized 0 at the beginning only, and if for any reason a thread has started summing, basically the thread won't start total summing after this, before this 0 initialization.
Correct. So you would essentially have this initialization here, and the initialization, like this particular statement, should be executed first, and then only would all the threads progress to execute their respective computations. And then here you have this atomic add operation, because see, you really want this total sum variable to be exclusively accessed by any particular thread in a CUDA thread block at a time. Okay, because you're essentially storing the partial sums here. So in a way, you can think that this execution is essentially serialized. Okay, so but still the gain that you can get here with respect to the previous version of the code is that, like, you directly ask the thread that is computing the column sums to update this total sum variable, and then at the end, once all of these operations have finished, you will then ask this last thread to actually compute the total sum and store it in Vn. Okay, so is this part clear?
Should it not be Vj plus 1 in the
Yeah,
if condition?
sorry, yeah, it should be, I guess, Vn, V capital N, because it will be the last element of the V array only, the n plus 1 at element essentially of the V array. So this would essentially be Vn only. But is this atomic add operation clear?
Yes, sir. Sir, but wouldn't there be an overhead of this?
Why do you say that?
Sir, because I have used parallel programming somewhere else, and in that case when we use atomic operations kind of especially when since it would be a shared operation, so we make sure that only a single thread can access it at once, and hence there is a kind of a overhead on accessing it.
Okay, let me take this. See what will I mean just to explain. Anirban, overall the structure is maybe we go it like this. We'll answer this, but first maybe you can just go to the atomic add. I mean that is explained, right? The atomic add part.
Yeah, so I just explained that. So if I want, I can explain the function signature once if anybody wants to.
Right. Let us go through the atomic add because they may be interested in this. Let's
Right. So essentially, atomic add takes in two arguments: the address of the variable in concern and the actual value that you want to sum to that particular variable. So here you have atomic add, but if you go through the atomic instruction set in the CUDA programming library, there are lots of nice atomic operations that are already there, like exchange, swap, then correspondingly subtract. All of these things are there. So this atomic add operation, as I said, so it's an exclusive operation which actually computes the sum of it, and finally in the last step, as pointed by one of the students, yeah, this should be Vn. So this is my mistake here. But anyways, I think just by changing this would be okay. So so should I run and show them the execution times, or would we just continue with this question first and then do that in
you can complete it. Just run and show them the execution time.
Oh.
Sir, can you please explain this atomic add in a little detail? I mean, how is it different from a simple addition?
Okay, so basically what is happening is suppose you just had one instruction to do the addition there, right? Now, what will happen? A normal addition that everybody will go through, right? But first of all, do you understand the atomicity part? I mean, why atomicity is required here?
So that only one thread is done with the addition and then the others can access.
Okay, we will discuss this. Let him first run the program once. We will discuss this. This is a general class, so we'll discuss this.
Right, sir. Okay.
Yes. Okay. So I'm just trying to run it with different values of n. So 0 essentially means the version of the program without the atomic operation, and 1 is the version of the program with that operation. So naturally, like for n with a lower value, you will see that there is not much of a time difference. But if I set n to 1024, which is the maximum number of threads for a thread block in this architecture that I'm using, you can see that there is quite a bit of speed up compared to the version which does not use the atomic instructions. Hello?
Yes, sir, it is visible. The speed up is visible.
Okay, so you only asked regarding that serialization thing, right? Or can you, or who was the student who asked, like he had implemented it in another programming paradigm and said that?
Yeah,
basically my doubt was that I see that since these are like as the thread ID increases, the load increases in that way. But if it would have been similar loads, then would then be a scheduling problem. Because right now, since the lower number, like lower ID thread has lesser load, so it can kind of sequentially override.
Right. So
override
we
this,
got
right?
your question. We got your question. So let us get back to that. So Nirvan, you are done with this?
Yes, I'm done.
Yeah. So
I will
reshare the screen again. Okay. So you see, I mean, whether that will be helping or us or not depends on a set of factors. In this case, it was helping, and there is a specific reason for that. And the reason here would be like you actually have the scenario that there is a load imbalance, as you can see, right? So some threads are still working while some other thread doesn't have much to do. So he can contribute here, and later on this guy comes in, he can contribute here. So you see that there is a load imbalance, so this may help here. But definitely, suppose there was some other application for which all the threads are roughly coming in at the same time, or maybe roughly, or some of them will come a bit later, some of them will come a bit, but on the average, from your algorithms, the behavior seems like, well, they would be very similar. Then having this doesn't make much sense, because anyway the barrier will ensure that if one or two threads or some threads are coming later, it will take care of it, right? Now let's just try and understand what is the overhead of doing all these things. The moment you are trying to make some operation atomic, that means let's understand what are you really doing. So this, you have a shared memory, right? You have to define that variable as a shared variable. That means that variable now is residing in the shared memory of the SM. So for each access, that would really be a shared memory access. That variable is not there in the register file of each of the SPs. Is this point taken, what I just said? Hello?
Yes, sir.
So if I think of the GPU, each of the SMs inside the GPU, so you have shared memory and then you have all the SPs here, right? And the register file here. Now, the moment you have to do this kind of operation, that variable has to be a shared variable here. So every thread, instead of doing local access, they have to do a shared memory access, which will take some order of magnitude more time. Well, shared memory access is fast with respect to the DRAM, but it is not fast if I compare with the local register file, right? So that will increase some time. Then the thing is, there has to be lower level hardware test and set instructions which have to guard this memory location. When you are, instead of doing a normal add, when you are doing any kind of atomic instruction, then the hardware has got some overhead. First of all, the hardware has to emit suitable assembly instructions so that this memory location gets a guard from the other threads, and only this thread can get in, modify, get out. Then the guard is again set. Another thread will come in, get the guard, modify and get out, right? So all these things will have the lower level overhead of both the hard as well as assembly, more number of assembly instructions which are executed, right? So you have a part thread overhead, would say. And this overhead is there in terms of compute, because you have to do some more computing, those lower level atomic instructions have to execute. And there is also a bit of data overhead, because you have to access the shared memory, right? So overall, it really depends on the application. Like say you are doing very lightweight application. Each of the threads, I mean, there is a huge load imbalance, and then each of the threads have got very lightweight application. So really, in which case this is going to help you or not is going to depend on the application. So you have to decide in a general scenario based on what is your requirement. Okay, if it is happening like that, that suppose I would have been just waiting here instead of doing all those fancy things, and each of the threads would not be taking too much of time, then it may not matter. But if the other threads, if the waiting period is long enough, okay, if the waiting period is long enough so that in between having this overhead doesn't matter, then it will be advantageous. Okay, so these are the things you have to keep in mind when you really go for an atomic operation. Okay, now just to clarify his query, like what is an atomic operation? So suppose you have these threads executing, and there is a normal addition that has to be done on a shared variable, not local variables, but on a shared variable v, right? So suppose you are doing v equal to v plus some value I, which is computed separately by each of the threads. Okay, that means this thread is going to come and give its own I. This thread is going to come and give its own I. This thread is going to come and give its own I. That is how it is going to happen, right? Let's say it is like this. Now, well, this is, I mean, well, I think I took this example here. For example, one thing can happen is among threads you may have a race condition, right? Like if I do not make it known to the system that this is a variable whom each of these threads are going to access, then one problem can be that says this thread is trying to access and at the same time this thread is going to access. Okay, so there is a race who will get the access first, right? Well, let us assume that eventually I will give access to one of them. Then in this case you may not have a problem because the order in which the addition will happen is not going to affect the total sum. But suppose it's really not so. Let's say what you are doing here, v equal to v operation I, where I is a local thread value, where I is a local value, and op is equal to plus if I percentile 2 equals 0 equal to minus if something else. Okay, I mean, I'm just trying to cook up some random example here where I'm trying to say that this operation can be different, and for the overall value, the operation order, well, I think again I have taken an example where the order will not matter. But let's say there is some operation for which in which way I do the increment or decrement or some other operation, it really matters. It can happen. There are many mathematical operations for which it can happen, right? So then I really have a problem, right? Because first of all, the threads may get into a race, and then the result may not be unique. That is another problem. The results may not be unique because at different times you will run the program. Different threads may come in and execute in different ways. You may not get the unique result. So overall, this hampers your functionality. So then what would be a good thing to do? You need to create a special kind of variable. So you will like to create a special kind of variable or a special memory management such that once this kind of a variable is defined with a suitable memory management called atomic in this case, it takes care whom to give the access. Whomever it is supposed to give the access, they have to have the requisite privilege. So now what will happen is even if multiple threads come in, they will follow this atomicity and give the access safely to one of them. Okay, so that is why for supporting this kind of atomic operation directly at the hardware level, CUDA and I mean maybe OpenCL and other languages also, they provide special instructions or this kind of functions for atomic add in this case and other math operations and also other operations like swap, I mean exchange and all that, right? Using which you can get your functionality done. Now, an alternative could have been that, well, I could have simply defined that this is my critical section like an operating system and say that, well, you get in here safely, get out here safely, and at a time only one of them can get in. I could have done that. But I think one primary reason, this I will repeat, I am also not entirely sure why they explicitly give the instructions which will ensure atomicity is that will reduce the hardware overhead, because then this entire atomicity checking will happen directly at the hardware level. If I use a standard OS primitive like using critical section and all that, then I am using the hardware facility to, I mean, remove the other threads from getting in, but here entirely it is all software overhead. Rather than that, if I do this, possibly things will be much faster if I have this atomic add as a lower level instruction. So that would be my explanation on what you are asking, that what is atomic add. I mean, just try to give you an idea how critical sections and stuff like that are implemented in parallel programs as well as firmware and all that. So are you okay with this?
Understood. Yes.
Okay, so this was our coverage of this week. In the next week, we'll go a bit more deeper. And in this week, now everybody has got some understanding. I mean, we have I think many of you may have gone ahead. I know that we have seen some of the, I mean, more material and all that. But let's understand why we are progressing at this pace. Because at the end of the day, this class is quite varied. People are there from varied backgrounds. So you are free to go ahead with the other lectures that are there. maybe in the online repository that that is there of NPTEL and other places. But here we will follow a slow pace because we have to have everybody catching up slowly, right? But right now we are at a situation where people can write CUDA programs, and given a parallel programming problem, you can create a CUDA program, run it and all that, because you have understood how threads can be defined, how barriers can be done and all that. So inside the weekend or maybe another 4 or 5 days, we will be posting some assignments for you for your practice part. And I think we had the short test time, which was defined, and everybody was acceptable with that. And there was some issue with the date of the long test 2, right? That March 1 or something. Hello.
Yes, sir. It was falling during the spring semester break.
Yeah. So no, that is long test 2, right? I'm just.
No, sir. Sir, that is long test 1.
Okay, let me just check once. Yeah. Long test 1, right? We have short test 1, short test 2, and long test 1. So long test 1, we have to shift the date. So fine. When does the spring break end? What is the date?
3rd March, sir.
Okay. So maybe in that weekend then, 6th, 7th March, that time. Hello. So what we'll do is we'll launch a poll on this. Okay, Anirban?
Okay.
We'll launch a poll on maybe 6th and 7th and 2 different timings. Morning, because I think first half and second half, let us give 2 timings.
Okay.
Evening and late night, something like that, and let's see. Or by the way, do you want to have it in the normal institute hours? Let us clarify, because we got a notice from institute that students are complaining that they are having, professors are driving them like crazy with odd hours of teaching. So I must clarify, because definitely it's a valid thing. So then we should have it at a standard time.
So if possible, we could do it just like 1 week after the right now scheduled time. I think it was scheduled for 1 March. So I think we could do it on 8th March. Would that be fine?
Not a problem with me. Give me a time slot. I was thinking, because 8th March, that time the other teacher will be taking up the course for the OpenMP MPI part, right? So instead of having it in the class hour, if we have it late in the evening, is that okay, or you want to have it during class hour, or what is the suggestion?
So I think if the syllabus allows it that way, then I think everyone would prefer it to be having in the class hours.
Okay, fine. Then maybe we will use we'll use this slot of 8th March. Let's see what is the date of 8th March. The day of 8th March.
Awesome.
So 8th March is a Monday, right? Monday we have 1 slot for this course.
Yes, sir. We have 5 to 6 on Monday.
Right. So do you have any class from 6 on Mondays, or is that free for all?
Sir, I have a lab from 6 on Monday.
I know this is the problem, because the test will take some more time.
Sir, we also have class from 6 to 8 on Mondays.
This is the problem with having planning any test or long test on class hours, because people will have classes right after the 1 hour slot. But okay, what about the Thursday date, 11th? Thursdays also after 6 you have class? No, I don't think so, because this is our 2 hour slot, right? Hello? Hello?
Sir, Thursday
Yes,
is also 1 hour.
Sir, we have
1 hour, sir.
HPSC class from 6 to 8. Sorry for interruption, sir.
We have HPSC class from 6 to 8 on Thursday.
Okay. Friday. Friday
No
is fine.
problem, sir, from my side. From my side, no problem, sir.
Okay, the others?
No problem, sir. So I think it would be much better if you could conduct a poll. I think.
Yeah. Then we will give a no. We have to find the poll options, right? At least, otherwise there will be no vote. So I think one option would be on 5th March, 5 to 6:30. Anirban.
Noting it.
And I think the other working, I mean, class hours anyway becomes null and void, because in any of the other class hours, everybody has got some dependency after the official hours, right? So that becomes a problem. So then actually I see this is the only solution, right? Because otherwise we are too late, and if we move it into February, then everybody will say it is too early. So let's then freeze it, right? I mean, 5th March, 5 to 6:30. Is that fine with all?
So 5th March is weekend or what?
It's Friday. 5th March is Friday. Our normal class hour is 5 to 6. We need half an hour beyond our class hour. So 5 to 6:30. Fine?
Yes, sir.
Okay then.
Sir, I needed to make an announcement for tomorrow's tutorial.
You do that.
Yeah, so we'll be having a 1 hour tutorial class tomorrow where we'll discuss about the links that were shared in the tutorial channel. Just a summary of how you would implement CUDA programs on Colab, and maybe I'll discuss the synchronization program in a bit more detail as well. Yeah, that's it.
So we do have a test on Monday, right? Can you share the details, like which platform and the test pattern and everything?
You mean this 25th January, that is the next Monday, we have the test, right? Yeah. I mean, what do you want for that?
So, like the syllabus, and will it be MCQ or will be required?
Syllabus will be whatever has been covered up to now.
Okay.
Yeah. And regarding the questions, that we are still thinking. We will send you a mail with that. But what is advisable right now is you take tomorrow's session. I think you all have gone through the videos that Anirban has posted. We recorded it last time during our lab, and thankfully it will help. And also you will take that Colab session tomorrow. So go through it very clearly. Then you get a platform, right, where you can do the code during the exam. But we are still pondering. I mean, whether it will have some code along with the MCQ, or I will just give MCQ and some theory questions on that. I'm still thinking on that. I will send you a mail maybe by today or tomorrow first up. Okay, you prepare based on whatever content we have and start writing CUDA programs based on that. Okay.
Okay, so and how much of the architecture do we have to remember? Like, it was a lot of data sheet material, a lot of that. So do we need to keep
what do you mean by data sheet material?
Like the number of streaming processors and everything, SMs, SPs, and so do we need to remember that for the architectures that were discussed?
No, those numbers you don't need to remember.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else? Any other doubts, please?
Yes, sir. I don't know if these were discussed, but I came approx 10 minutes late, so I had some doubt in lecture 3.
Yes, please.
So first of all, there was function prototype defined before the CUDA kernel function was actually defined. So is it necessary, or it was just a good programming practice?
It is actually necessary.
Which
at least
is the
for
slide number you were talking about?
Sir, I will just tell you.
I mean the vector addition?
Yes, sir. I will just tell you the slide number. It has opened on my. So slide number 8 and I guess line number 3, the prototype.
Yeah, so this you have to give, because then the system will use this as a handle to create the function spaces and all that.
So because I asked, because in general C, it is optional, right? So it is compulsory here.
Yeah.
And sir, in the code while compiling, it has been written that we have to give a separate file for kernel.cu and host.cu. I will just tell the slide number. Slide number 13.
I think this kind of thing you can take up in the tutorial. Okay, I mean the compilation and those things that you can take up in the tutorial.
Okay, sir. So I also had doubt in what is a generic pointer. I haven't heard this phrase.
Tell me the slide number. Yes, it is there. I remember. Just want to go to that context.
Generic pointer. Sir, slide number 15. It has been used there. And
slide number 15.
Lecture 3, slide number 15.
Okay, so that reason is basically you are allocating memory, right? I mean, right now you are not sure what kind of memory object you are going to put in, right? So the way you will work is, I mean, this void start star is going to give you a generic pointer. That means given what kind of data you will put, accordingly it can be easily typecasted. You know about void pointers in normal C programs, right? So think something on those lines.
Okay, sir. And so why is it like a 2D pointer kind of a thing? Is it just like what it has been defined as, or there is a reason behind it?
This I am not fully sure, but what we have seen is in CUDA, the generic, I mean, this, first of all, this is the data type of, I mean, there's a type definition of CUDA malloc, okay? And the next thing is, well, what they are really doing, you see, DA is already a pointer, right? And this is void star star because you are essentially again passing the address of DA. Okay, but your question may be that why do I really need to do that? I could have just passed the DA itself. The reason they have kept it like this, as I again said, that well, I do not, this function should be working in all the cases, right? Whether whatever is the type of data buffer I give it, it should be working. Now, why void star star? Yeah, that's interesting.
Sir, the matrix is two-dimensional, right? Rows and columns.
Yeah, okay. In this case, that should be the obvious reason for that.
Yes.
So, but isn't like anywhere we have seen, even as in a simple, not in a matrix form, but even in simple vector form, it has been used as void double star everywhere, like in a 1D vector. This program is for 1D.
No, I understand. There is some specific reason also why you may need a pointer to pointer. I will get back on this. I remember why you need generic pointer, but the void star star, there is some deeper level also. Last time we taught it. This time I have again forgotten. I have to look into it once.
Sir, so that means wouldn't the reason be that the variable's value would change basically? It's a pointer to pointer is required because the address it is pointing to.
You want to update the pointers itself actually.
Yes, exactly, sir. That is why we are passing it as a reference itself.
Right.
Passing the pointer as a reference.
Right.
Similar to like it is same we do in linked list actually. Pass the head as a double pointer.
Here the idea is that you have to update the pointers itself. But still I will look into once again. I think that is the thing. I will just look into. I'm not very confident right now. Yes. Any other? So this thing I'm noting down. I think it should be that only. I will note this down. Hello?
Yes, sir. So the last doubt which I had was that our device function callable only from the same device or like from any GPU device? I am
No, from that device only.
From that device.
Another GPU device is sitting completely in a different context with this different memory space, right? So that I mean like in programs we have the concept of scopes. I mean this is much more difficult, right? Because they are completely different hardware cards. So if you push in another GPU, that means you are attaching another card on the PCI Express bus. So they have completely different memory spaces. So that won't happen. I mean it's inside the same device. Yes.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I think the reason of wired star would be like he mentioned. It should be like that because you have to update the pointers also. That's how we do it. But still, I will look into it once again. Okay, and maybe we will post it in that student discussion thread. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Sir, I had another question regarding sync threads. When
Yes,
we have less than 32 threads which are running in parallel, and we do not mention the sync threads option,
right?
There's no exact guarantee that they're going to be exactly in lockstep, right? It's only logically in lockstep.
There is no guarantee for
the threads to be in lockstep or to execute exactly at the same time when they're spread out across the space.
I mean, if the number of threads is less than 32, you have a guarantee from the hardware that they are executing exactly in lockstep.
Okay, so is there like some sort of mechanism which makes sure that all of them exactly execute at the same time?
Yeah, so what the GPU will do is GPU picks up 32 threads together from the blocks, okay, and packs them together into what we are calling as a warp, okay, and so threads inside a warp execute in lockstep every instruction.
Okay.
Sir,
I think you joined late today.
So I guess this scenario will never happen, right? So suppose there are two programs which are simultaneously trying to access the GPU. One has just 11 threads, and the other one has say another 11 threads.
Two programs simultaneously trying to access the GPU.
Okay, yeah, and one launched 11 threads, another launched suppose say 40 threads. Then
no, but the first question is how we launch two kernels to the GPU at a time.
So you said that there are schedulers in the GPU, right? So can't I run two CUDA programs together?
That scheduler will take care of managing all the threads launched by one kernel.
Okay, I see. I mean, so like suppose I have two programs. Now I try to run means in two terminals. I have two programs, and I try to run both of them together. Then at a time, only one of the programs will be accessing the GPU, and another will wait.
The moment one host program launches a kernel, the GPU will not look at anything else.
Okay, I see.
It's blocked. Okay, now let me tell the other things. So after all these things, in modern times, there are a few optimizations that have come up. One is concurrent kernel execution, like how the GPU can manage multiple kernels together. The way to do that in CUDA would be using CUDA streams. So this is something we'll teach later on. So in CUDA, you can launch multiple streams, and in each stream you can launch one kernel. Okay. But then everything after that will be done as per whatever we are doing. But it's just that GPU gets divided physically across multiple kernels.
Okay.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Sir, I have a small doubt. Like
yes.
While allocating memory in the GPU using CUDA malloc, do we need to free it every time, or it will get automatically freed in the program itself?
There is no automatic free. I mean, you have to do a CUDA free.
Like, is it necessary to do every time?
I mean, see, at that time, if I mean, like I'm assuming there is no concurrent kernel or anything, only your program is executing. So if you don't do it, then that memory is not available for future mallocs, right?
Like when the program exits, like what will happen? It will automatically.
No.
will not
When the
free.
program exits, then there is no context in the memory, right? I am questioning while the program is executing, then that memory, suppose your program at different points of time, it will do dynamic memory allocation. All I am saying is that if something is not free, then it is not available during the execution of that program.
Okay.
Okay.
So one more thing, related to the warp size. So warp size 32 is set assuming that at least 32 SPs are there in each SM. Is that the case? Because we need 32 SPs to make sure that all of them
In
happen.
each SP, you have 512 or more SPs in each SM.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, that is the power of GPU. You have a big register file and lot of processors who are very simple, but lot of them.
Right. So why is the warp size not increased now, sir, compared to before?
These things we'll discuss when we come to the scheduling classes. Okay, I mean, hold on for some time. We'll be doing all this.
Okay.
Okay, so is there anything else or shall we adjourn for today?